My Psychedelic Roots, a podcast of conversations with people from a broad swath of lived experience to explore their psychedelic beginnings or roots, what led them to start using psychedelics, what those early experiences were like, and how those roots have impacted their life's unfolding. My name is Amy Bartlett, and it is my hope that these stories, generously shared by my guests, offer a perspective and insight into the lived reality of psychedelic experiencing, both the shadow and the light. So whoever, wherever, and whenever you are, and whether you're well-traveled in this realm or just beginning to explore, welcome. I'm glad you're here. In today's episode, I sit down with Sheldomar Elliot, a colleague of mine in the Laboratory for Culture and Mental Health Disparities at University of Ottawa. He's a warm, generous, and thoughtful person, and I think these qualities really shine through in our conversation and in his background. With years of experience in food justice, community support, and research roles, Sheldomar is deeply committed to addressing food insecurity and advancing Black food sovereignty across the city of Toronto. He actively learns from community members, elders, and peers, using story to ground his justice work in their wisdom. And alongside his dedication to food justice, Sheldomar is passionate about exploring the intersections of psychedelics with access, community, and healing. Recognizing a connection between food justice and psychedelic justice, he conducts research rooted in equity and inclusion, aimed at creating a more just psychedelic space while supporting sustainable food systems in Toronto and beyond. Through this integrated approach, Sheldomar centers marginalized communities, empowering them in the pursuit of justice and healing in whatever form that takes. My conversation with Sheldomar touches on the magic of curiosity in childhood, and we talk about his experiences navigating the multidimensional paths towards spiritual and racial identity formation, trying to fit the molds that he found, and ultimately finding his own beautiful light. And it was a real pleasure spending time exploring his story together. So let's hear more about Sheldomar's psychedelic roots. Sheldomar, thank you so much for joining me on this blustery March afternoon. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Amy. Yes, thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to jump into things with you. You know, it's not often that I get asked to explore my psychedelic roots. So this feels like the right space to do that with the right person.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time out in this very busy semester.
Yeah, totally. Well, thanks for that. My name is Sheldomar Elliot. Happy to be here. I'm 28 years old. I live in Toronto, born and raised. Been here my whole life. I come from a mixed family background. So I'm third generation Portuguese from my mom's side and second generation Jamaican from my dad's side. I love my parents dearly. I know they love me too. But yeah, I'm also navigating relationships with parents as an adult. That's a whole other thing. But that's probably not the podcast, or this is probably not the space to dive into that exactly. But yeah, I come from these really two interesting backgrounds, which has really informed how I show up in the world and how I see myself, how I relate to others, and sort of my position on certain things. I've been really involved in food justice work for the past couple of years now. So I'm currently at Food Share Toronto, which is a food justice nonprofit out here in Toronto, really focused on ensuring that Torontonians get access to culturally appropriate food, fresh and affordable food, in a way that's dignifying and full of joy, while also challenging some of these systems that get in the way of people being able to access food. So whether that's running campaigns to support ODSP rates or encouraging livable wages, a lot of poverty reduction work masked behind food justice, which I could go on and on about. Food is very dear to my heart. I'm also an urban farmer. I love to cook. I love to talk about food. So that's also something that we can do another time. Yeah, big food person over here. And yeah, I don't want to give too much away, but I'm happy to be here. Psychedelics has been a part of my life for almost 10 years now. And I'm sure you'll have some really great prompts to allow me to explore a little bit further as to the reasons why.
That's wonderful, Sheldomar. I really appreciate that. And really inspired by the work that you're doing in the justice space. And we'll share websites and links to the work that you're doing if people are interested in the show notes. So, yeah, thank you
Yeah.
for sharing a little bit about your professional background. You mentioned and talked a little bit about your childhood and where you've come from and how that has informed how you've evolved professionally into the justice space and the food justice space in particular. I'm curious as it pertains to psychedelics and bringing it into your psychedelic experiencing, thinking back to your younger self before the psychedelics, before the food justice. How would you describe your way of seeing the world and what felt true to you when you were a
Mm,
child?
mm, that's a great question. Well, for more context about like who I am outside of psychedelics, the food piece is really big, and I'll bring that back up in a moment. But I think as a child, I was always so curious about the world, and I remembered being so young and really appreciating being around adults, people much older than me. I found that I was always intrigued about learning about what other people were thinking and doing and why they thought the things that they did. From a young age, adults would say, wow, you're really an old soul kind of thing. And I think to this day, I still very much feel that way. Um, I love music. I have a quite eclectic taste of music. You probably can't see me right now, but I'm wearing an Aphex Twin shirt. So I love my house music, my techno music, but my jazz and my R&B. Um, and I think as a kid, I really sort of, amidst learning from adults and also hanging out with people my age, I was able to use music as a way to escape. Um, Additionally, I'm a big nerd. So I love my games. I love Magic the Gathering. I don't know if folks have heard about that, but it's a nerdy but low-key the best trading card game you could ever play. I've been playing that since I was like maybe 9 or 10 years old. And really just these different activities that continue to feed and nourish that inner child piece of me.
Mm,
So, bringing it back to food, I think I grew up in a quite religious household. My dad being from Jamaica, and his mom being a pastor, we grew up in a very Christian sort of space. And then on my mom's side, her mom was Catholic. So I was always like in this Christianity sort of bubble.
yes.
And yeah, so a lot of that iconography and symbolism growing up. And at the same time, I spent a lot of time with my grandmother in her garden on my Portuguese side. And I
Mm,
think some of my earliest memories is actually just being out there with her. And she's passed now, so rest in peace. But,
mm,
her, picking cucumbers and tomatoes and like tending to like the greens and whatnot. And I would just be standing beside her, like observing and not really understanding what was happening. But a couple of hours later, we'd be in the kitchen preparing something together with that. Um, and I think she had a fear of like me, messing things up. So as she was doing this in the garden, I'd be paying attention, but also playing with the bugs. So I was very much a nature boy and picking up worms and making sure they weren't getting cut up while, we were digging through the soil. So I always had this affinity to land and nature. And I think that really sort of helped to sort of color my worldview as to like, yeah, how I see myself and informing some of those basic components of my spirituality and this understanding of, I'm a part of this and I'm a part of that. And like the way my cats look at me, like, yeah, y'all are me in a way, but just in a different body. Of course, 6-year-old Sheldomar couldn't go around telling the other kids that because I was already weird enough.
mm,
And I also did struggle a little bit with my identity,
mhm,
being a mixed race black person. It's a very common experience of like not being black enough or not being white enough, but also with a name like Sheldamar.
mm,
Yeah, that was really easy for kids to pick on. So I
mm,
made the conscious decision. I was probably around 10 years old and we were moving a lot around a lot, and my parents got divorced, to start going by Sheldon.
mm,
And you know, that served me for a bit of time. I think it was an attempt for me to sort of assimilate into groups and like be around other kids in a way that was like just easier for them to say my name.
mm,
But it was much later in life, and I won't jump ahead too much, but it was around the same time I started to explore psychedelics, and I met someone who sort of challenged me on that. And they said, "So what's your name?" And I'm like, "Oh, it's Sheldon, but it's Sheldamar, but I go by Sheldon." And they're like, "But why do you do that?" And it was the first time in a very long time that someone prompted me to reflect on this and realizing like I was born Sheldamar. Why don't I go by Sheldamar?
Mm.
So I reclaimed that. And I say all this just to say, yeah, figuring out your identity as a kid, being the weird one out, liking music that people are like, what are you listening to? Um, it made me feel different, but I always trusted that I was trying to stay true to who I was from the beginning,
Mm.
despite, you know, maybe trying to shift and change into different forms just to please other people. Uh,
Yes.
yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. In the psychedelic space, we talk a lot about, the or versus the and.
Mm,
So much of our thinking when we're in pain or in sort of, in duality in which we live as human beings, we talk about the or and things are one way or the other and that we have to choose. And I love how you described your childhood in that the way you described it, it made me think about the and. It felt like a very and experience that you were sort of embracing everything, identity wise, but also in the spiritual sense.
right.
It sounds like you grew up in a very religious household, and yet you were also passionate about games and Magic the Gathering and just sort of like there is a magic as well as a structure to
Totally.
those beginnings. That's really beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. And it had its challenges, like I said, my grandmother being a pastor and every Christmas insisting on buying me a Bible. So I'd go through the Bible. My friends to this day still tease me on the fact that in grade 8, I won Christian Student Attitude Award. And I actually,
Congratulations.
thank you so much. Yeah, it's in my CV if you ever want to read about it. Um, but I found the plaque the other day. And my partner's like, you cannot throw this out. But it just reminds me of like, I never, to be honest, like felt Christian in a way. But clearly my attitudes and my actions showed something different. So I always consider myself spiritual as a kid.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, that I think that wonder for life and that curiosity about how people think and why they think and do the things they do followed me up until today. And that's sort of why I'm doing what I'm doing today.
Yeah, it's lovely. And also, it felt the way you've described it. I also hear a lot of like embodiment
Mm,
in your experience in relationship to nature and to wonder,
yeah,
and that, being in your grandmother's garden and playing with the bugs. And it's really beautiful that again, that andness in a couple different ways that I
totally.
really, really appreciate.
Yeah, yeah.
So, you mentioned as part of this identity formation phase also with your name and someone challenging you on your name and reclaiming that name and that sort of dovetailing a little bit with your eventual curiosity and explorations towards psychedelics. I'm curious, was that a moment or was there a particular moment or experience that made you get curious about psychedelics, or how did that name experience fit into that transition?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll say on top of being curious about the world, I was never ignorant to the injustices of the world. And I think that just came from being curious about different people and their experiences. I remember being a kid and, I grew up, I won't say low-ish income situation and spending time downtown Toronto and seeing folks on the street and always asking my parents, like, why are people, living outside here? Or like I knew my parents would spend time at food banks and like recognizing that there was something inherently wrong with our system, but being a child, you can't really wrap your head around it or understand it.
Mm.
And I think this followed me into elementary school where I kind of got, I don't know if you got picked up, but there was that meet a wee thing that used to happen,
I
right?
remember, yes.
Yes. And it was definitely an interesting way to get kids thinking about social issues in a sort of saviory kind of way. But that did help prime me to be like, okay, like I'm part of a bigger world, and there's things that are clearly wrong with the world. How can I do something about it?
Right.
So I say that to say, like, I always had this care and love for seeing a better and more just world. My dad, funny enough, is a police officer. So the conversation of drugs was never on the
Mhm.
table. And if it was, it was laced with like, yeah, punitive measures or criminality or these different things that as Black
Yeah.
folks we already experienced, but as an
Yeah.
immigrant himself and just as a child, it's like that is just not on the table. Don't even think about it.
Yeah.
Mind you, my mom was very different. She was much
Mm.
more, it still is a sort of free spirited kind of person and had her own psychedelic experiences as a young person that I learned about much later in my life,
Wow.
which were quite funny. But yeah, no harm reduction practice there. Um, yeah, and so yeah, I always knew that drugs were a thing,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, had a very rigid view on what they were. And it
Mm.
wasn't until I was in grade 8 and we had a presentation on like we had police officers come and it was kind of this dare program, like teach us about drugs, and then we got broken up into different groups and we had to do a presentation on said drug. And I did mine on shrooms, which was really funny.
Mm.
Fast forward to today, some of my
Mm-hmm.
favorite friends. But that was the first time I really learned about these things, again, in a very negative light. And it's like you'll lose your mind and all these kind of stereotypes that we hear about. But it clicked something in me. I'm like, okay, there are stuff out here that people use to alter their consciousness. Like, what is this about? I'm going throughout high school now. High school is a weird time, like it is for most of us. And I was still very much in my saintly kind of attitude, following that Christian attitude award of like no drugs, no alcohols, no party
Mm.
kind of thing.
Mm.
Um, Luckily, a friend sort of insisted, like, you know what, you're only in high school once. Like, come on, come out, join a party, just like relax a little bit. And I think that helped shift me and realize like I'm not a bad person for exploring different substances or trying new experiences, and just crack the door open a little bit to what I could do with my life.
Mm.
Um, so now fast forward to university days, and my name, I think university is hard, point blank period.
Mm-hmm.
It's not for everybody. And I was dealing with some stuff during my undergrad specifically. I went to Toronto Metropolitan University. I studied environmental, urban, and sustainability. So still
Mm.
very much in line with like this nature affinity and relationship to living in a city, but also trying to find ways to sustain nature. But depression and anxiety was really real. And again, coming from a family that had very strict ideas on what these things were and mental health, I sort of wanted to explore solutions for myself. So before I started getting into psychedelics, the same friend who encouraged me to go to parties encouraged me to
Mm-hmm.
start traveling with him.
Mm.
Um, so we did some backpacking throughout Central America. And he's like, would you rather spend your summer in the club in Toronto or do you want to go see some beautiful rainforests and stuff? And I'm like, okay, well, you don't have to sell me on much. And
Yeah.
it was during a trip to Guatemala, which was a wonderful, wonderful time
Mm.
where I met this person. I won't name them, but
Mm-hmm.
we had a really beautiful conversation underneath the moonlight. It was a full moon. I remember like it was the perfect setting. And we just talked about life. Funny enough, they were from Mississauga, which is like a
Mm.
skip away from where I'm living.
Yeah.
And I was like, how did we meet each other in Guatemala? Like, what are the chances? And yeah, just encouraged me to reflect on who I am as a person. And after realizing, like, I was born as Sheldomar, I need to reclaim that part of myself. It was sort of an unfolding from there, tenfold sort of thing.
Wow.
And by letting go of this, I guess, persona or version of me that I called Sheldon, and really stepping back into myself as Sheldamar, I was like, you know what else can I explore? And what else is me?
Mm.
So shortly after that trip, I, and I guess kind of prior to, I was learning about psychedelics. I
Mm-hmm.
heard about people just talking about them really like in party settings, like mushrooms and LSD, whatever. And I still had this fear. It was like, oh God, like the schizophrenia, all that kind of stuff.
Mm.
But I spent countless, countless hours on Reddit and Arrowhead and all of these forums, just reading people's experiences about like what happens or what comes up. And needless to say, whether the universe presented it in this way or not, I was at a friend's place one night
Mm.
and one of them brought mushrooms and was like, you know what? Tonight's the night we're going to do some mushrooms. And the rest is kind of history in terms of like that one moment. So it's hard to say like there's one thing that triggered it, but I
Of
really do
course.
feel like, stepping back into myself as Sheldamar allowed me to be more open to what the world has to offer rather than
Mm,
just trying to live up to this way that people have perceived me for so long.
that's really beautiful. Words are so important, again, in the psychedelic space and for us as human beings. And that's such a beautiful stepping into self, again, with the same curiosity that it sounds like you were embracing as a child when you were Sheldamar,
Right.
a reclaiming of the name, but also perhaps of that curiosity and those
Totally.
questions and that sort of beautiful life force
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
comes from that time. I'm curious, one question in terms of your Reddit explorations and sort of I understand from what you've said, this moment of reclaiming your name and being curious about what that meant and what the world held for you, and feeling nervous about psychedelics based on your DARE research for when you were a kid. But also, you were looking around and
Yeah.
there was a curiosity there. I'm curious, maybe there isn't an answer, but I'm
Mm.
curious why you were reading those Reddit forums. What were you looking for? Were you looking for reassurance? Were you looking to allay fears? Were you looking for inspiration? Or
Yeah.
something completely different?
No, that's a great prompt. I mean, the first thing that's coming to mind is reading about the possibility of more. And like thinking there's more than just this. And I know that's kind of vague and floaty, but again, coming from this like spiritual like curiosity, a wonder about the world, and learning from a young age, like these things will change your mind and how you see the world. And then meeting people throughout university and being like, man, like I saw this and that. I was like, okay, let's see what's really going on here. And yeah, I think from some of those first moments of reading stories, I was like, wait, entities? Wait,
Mhm.
geometry?
Mm,
Like, wait, God? Like, what is going on here? And it was just that rabbit hole effect of like, wait, I need to know more. Like, is this common? Is this like, why are multiple people having these kind of experiences? Why aren't people talking about this? Why,
right.
and then eventually, I think around 2015, 2016, more of the scientific articles start coming out from like Roland Griffiths and Robin Carr Harris around like the
Mm,
anxiety and the depression. I'm like, okay, there is something here that's worth exploring. So yeah, I think it was a little bit of that. Just realizing like it can't just be pharmaceuticals. And no, no shame. I know folks need
mhm,
medication where needed, but I
of
was like,
course.
let me figure something out. And
Mm,
already having an affinity for nature and food and plants in this way,
mm,
like mushrooms, like, hey, I already eat mushrooms. Like, what about these kind of mushrooms? And
mm.
uh, yeah,
So,
it really opened it.
so really reading between the lines, you were looking at this not just for the spirituality, but I'm also hearing, as you're citing Robin Carhart Harris or Roland Griffiths, I sense you're also citing some of the mental health challenges and looking for solutions for the mental health challenges that you were facing during that
Right.
time, the depression, anxiety that you had mentioned.
Totally. And
Yeah.
I think, admittedly, as a university kid, I felt maybe another coping mechanism of escapism is what I could lead into. I was like,
Yeah.
maybe I could just like escape and like get away from my mental stuff for a bit. But then
Mhm.
after learning that there's actually mental health benefits, I'm like, okay, well, I can escape and get better, maybe. I don't know. And I had to practice it myself because I could not open up that conversation with most people
Mm,
around me,
mhm.
besides just a couple of close friends and my brothers, but not my dad. And it took me some time
Yeah,
to get around to my mom. Yeah.
right. And it sounds, speaking of your larger support network, so there's your family. It also sounds like you had a lot of friends around you who were supportive or at a minimum were introducing you to this concept. And it's interesting to me to hear you say, you were doing this, you were curious about this for some of the mental health pieces. And yet that first experience, it sounds like was in a more recreational context.
It was, yeah.
Mm.
And it's just funny how life plays out sometimes in this way.
Hmm.
I guess we can call it the beta test of it all. And yeah, it was a friend's house. He had his parents went away, so we had the place to ourselves. And another buddy brought them. I was with my brother also, and it was like maybe
Oh, nice.
five or six of us. And yeah, I was like, well, to be honest, I knew deep down like this wasn't really the way I wanted to experience this thing, just given everything I've read and learned about online. I'm like, how often does this happen? And I don't really have access to these things at the moment. Let me just give this a try. So yeah, it was a Saturday night, and we took it. And again, harm reduction wasn't really being practiced, so we all kind of just put our
Mm.
hands in a bag and you throw in whatever you have.
Wow.
Looking back, it was probably like a medium dose of
Mhm.
psilocybin specifically.
Mhm.
And yeah, I remember an hour in, I closed my eyes for a moment and I probably didn't open them again for another 30 minutes because I'm like, there's what is going on here? All the sacred geometry started to come about. I started to see jokers and jesters. I was like, okay, whoa, what is like what? Like how?
Mm.
Everybody else was having a very different reaction. And I think to this day, I'm still very much someone who, while I'm under the influence, I retreat inward and I become so introspective. Meanwhile, people around me can be much more active and open eyes and like, whoa, like can you think about this? Whoa, think about that. And the night kind of went on for a little bit like that. Luckily, one of our friends was sober. So he thought it'd be a good idea for us to go for a walk. And it was summertime, so
Mm.
we agreed for it. And he lived near a mall. So we decided to go to the mall and they had this art installation up in the middle of the night. So he's kind of hung out there and just laughed about the world and made fun of things and just, yeah, just enjoyed it. Had a lot of fun, very little fear, which was nice. I think part of it was being with my brother and people that I trusted. And then we head back to his apartment, put on some music. I was like, wow, does music always sound this good? Especially as a music person. Like I
Yeah.
just had a brand new appreciation for it. And we kind of ended the night watching some Netflix and just sort of tapering down the activities. But yeah, it really proved to me that I don't have to be afraid of these things as much, that I can trust myself even in this altered state of consciousness. Mind you, I wasn't really using other substances to this point. Like I've drinking a little bit of alcohol here and there, smoked a little bit of weed, but this was the first time I was elsewhere. And it just proved to me like, okay, amidst all the laughs and the giggles and people like jumping up and down and having a good time, those moments where I was able to close my eyes and reflect, there was something else happening. And it just, again, this curiosity of Sheldamar, I was like, I need to understand what is going on. So immediately went back to the forums and just continued to research. And yeah, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but that really prompted me to go full fledged into like what is going on in the psychedelic experience.
Mm. It's such a beautiful first encounter in the sense, like you say, there was very little fear. Sometimes that first encounter can be a lot for folks, but it
Totally.
sounds like it was a safe environment. It's wonderful that there was someone who was sober there,
Yeah,
and it seemed like it sparked your curiosity to go deeper.
exactly. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
And so it's you characterize that experience as your beta test.
Yeah.
Um, what would you consider your full test,
Ah, okay.
your launch?
The launch, right?
Mm.
It's funny. So the same friend, and I'll name him. He's my best friend. His name is Jamal. I don't get to see him often anymore, but because he lives in Europe, but we talk all the time, and yeah, he's super proud of where I am today because, yeah, almost 10 years ago we are talking about the thing and thinking about doing the thing, and now I'm doing the thing. But yeah, I was hanging out with Jamal one day. He's like, I know somebody who has acid. And I'm like, whoa, like acid. That's a scary one. He's like, no, like we've done our research, we've read everything, like we'll do it in the safe way, one tab, that's it. We'll just go for a walk around the our neighborhood. It'll be like a good day. So like, you know what? Like I think I'm ready. So that day came, we dropped just a tab each, say around afternoon time, really with the intention to explore like what is going on here. Let's go see what happens outside. Like let's just go experiment a little bit. And for folks who know, yeah, LSD and mushrooms are similar but very different. And I learned that very quickly when I stepped outside and I was like, wow, like look at the world. Am I this tree? Am I, the clouds? And I recall us we spent maybe 6 hours or so just walking around the neighborhood, bumped into a few people that we knew, which was like felt really serendipitous in a way. Some of them we felt comfortable saying like, okay, like we're tripping right now. Others we were just trying to play it off as if, I don't know, it was just like a goofy day or whatnot.
Mhm.
But that was a really beautiful day, and I really, through those Reddit scours and whatnot, I learned about this idea of like oneness and like feeling a part of everything. And by the end of that day, I really felt that, like, truly. And it reminded me of that sort of childlike state of mind of like feeling like I was a part of the garden and the bugs and the food and
Mm,
my grandmother and this interconnectedness to everything. And yeah, Jamal and I had just really great conversations, some really deep conversations about who we are and how we show up in the world. But
mm,
it was so nice to be able to explore those parts of our relationship in a way that felt safe and nourishing. And like we really saw each other for who we were. I remember at
mm.
one point looking over to him and he looked like, I'm not going to say like an alien in a bad way, but he looked like he just came from another planet and his skin was blue and he had these symbols on his skin. And I was like, dude, like, what just had like, did you just arrive? Like, this was some Star Trek stuff. And we laughed about it, but like, yeah, weeks later, continuing to talk about that and just realizing how impactful that one experience was for us. That was like, okay, there is something here. I don't know what I'm gonna do with it. I know I will continue to experiment with this, maybe sometimes safely, sometimes unsafely, but yeah, I can't not let this just happen and go away. So yeah, that really sat with me, that experience right there. And
Mm.
that was a launch, I think, from to being like, okay, I'm studying environment and urban sustainability right now and I love it, but eventually I got to get to a place where I can do this a bit more overground per se, and
Yeah,
not kind of hide in my room and just like, talk with a few
mm,
friends, but yeah, talk about it in a real more open way.
it's very interesting. And I love how both your beta test and your full launch, it sounds like we're very relational. You had
Mhm.
an opportunity to learn about yourself through and with others.
Right.
And again, in that sort of and way that seems
Yes.
to be a thread throughout your story. I think that's really beautiful. I'm curious, how was that second experience with LSD different from the mushrooms? Because there are some similarities there. What about it was different for you, and how was it different than you expected?
Great question. And I recall, I don't know where I learned this analogy. It could have been in those early YouTube days. I spent a lot of time watching, of course, listening to the Terrence McKenna's and the Ram Dass. And I used to watch this show called Drugs Lab
Mm,
in Netherlands and Psych Substance and all these people informing what I thought these things would be.
mm,
And somewhere along the lines, I heard this analogy of like, with mushrooms, you're the passenger in the car and the mushrooms are
mm,
driving. And with LSD, you're the driver. And I kind of really felt that after my LSD experience because as I said, with mushrooms, I become and to this day, I get really in my head, not in a bad way,
mhm,
but I become like a mushroom. Like I'm planted, I'm quiet, I'm just there, present with myself internally.
mm,
With acid, I'm much more open and awake and alert and aware of like my outside worlds. And that differed greatly from the mushroom experience that I had prior to that. It made me realize like there's similarities here, but yeah, each can serve a different purpose in a way.
mm,
And admittedly, it was because of that openness and awareness and being able to be present socially was why I
mm,
experimented with acid a lot more than I did with psilocybin moving forward from that experience.
right.
Yeah, some of those instances got me into some trouble and some scares, but I think I
Mhm,
learned a lot from those moments of playing it a little unsafe and the
mhm,
importance of harm reduction and yeah, making sure it's set and setting of course, but the people you're with, avoid mixing. Public is probably not the best place to be on these substances, and yeah, all these different lessons that I carry really closely with me
mhm.
now.
If nothing else, you were a student,
Yes, that's
and that very much sort of holds true with that. And I'm curious, Sheldamar, um, you'd mentioned the anxiety and depression being part of the motivation in starting to explore the possibility of this. I'm curious if those early experiences had any impact on the anxiety and depression that you were experiencing at that time.
yeah. I'm really glad you mentioned that, and I think that. Those first, I'd say first year of experimenting, it definitely had an impact on the anxiety and depression. I think unconsciously speaking.
Mm,
And I think it was exploring this new thing that I've never experienced before, exploring these new altered states of consciousness or non-ordinary states of consciousness allowed me to actually forget about those issues that were causing me depression and anxiety,
mm,
but they were still there.
right.
And they began to worsen over time. And I think I got to a point where, there's a lot of family things, a lot of school things, and just life generally is throwing at me that I think it was McKenna. Shout out McKenna always, who insisted on like his McKenna drop protocol, which was like a 5 gram trip in a sensory deprived environment.
Yes.
And I thought, you know what? Maybe this could give me some insight that I would need or kind of help me overcome some of these challenges. And without getting too much into it, I think I was getting to a point in my life where I was really being faced with my own mortality and the mortality of the people around me. So I had a lot of anxiety around death. And, I've been around death my whole life, my grandparents passing at a young age, but as you age, you start to reckon with like, oh my gosh, I'm a living thing that will one day be unalive. Um, so I thought maybe this 5 gram trip, that will be my intention going to this experience, is like exploring death in this way.
Mm,
Without getting too deep into the experience, I learned a lot. I learned so much about myself, and I had this really profound moment that gives me goosebumps whenever I think about it. So I have goosebumps actively
mm,
of I felt like I was hanging out with my grandparents
mm,
and I was kind of looking at them through this window and they were on the other side of the window and they were so excited to see me. They're like, "Oh my God, Sheldon, you're here. Like, it's so nice to see you. It's been so long." And I'm like, "I'm here, but I'm not there." Like I like hi and I'm waving at them and I'm like, "I'm so happy to see you too." And they're like, "Okay, like you don't have to be here yet. It's too soon, but just know like we're here when it's over. When you want to come over here, we're waiting for you." And
mm,
yeah, I could cry right now thinking about it, but
mm,
that really gave me the reassurance I needed to know that life is just a part of like the play. Whether we want to believe in the afterlife or we call it heaven or whatnot, it just offered me this reassurance that things will be okay and I can continue on through life and whatever happens, happens. And at the end, I will be reunited with my loved ones. And I think from that moment on, my anxiety just dropped. Depression also
mm,
dropped, and life still, ebbs and flows and things happen and my
mhm,
emotions can rise and go down. But
mhm,
yeah, it was like a 180 shift from that moment on. And I think from that day too, I've been so much more keen on having conversations about death and like
mm,
how does death inform our lives? And I think a lot about if I have the privilege of being old and being able to reflect back on my life, like what do I really want to think about and what do I want to be happy and cherish? And to
mhm,
me, it's so simple. It's really, the relationships I've built and the people I've loved and the time I've spent with them, the food I ate, the music I listened to, the places
mm,
I've seen, and really the lives I've impacted. I think from those me to we days, I had a lot of pressure on myself of like, you got to change the world, like we need to help the kids in Africa and all that. And I'm like, now I'm like, yes, but like I can also focus on my local community and make sure my family's well. And yeah, so it just helped shift my perspective on how I see my life and trusting in my ability to take life on a little bit more authentically,
mm,
with the name change and just coming to myself. So yeah, it really proved to me like, wow, like I feel better, I really feel better and I could take on school and different things as they came more
mm,
easily. And yeah, I think the first LSD trip kind of opened that door up along with that first psilocybin trip, but it was that specific, 5 gram deep dive that was like, wow, okay, this stuff is special. Yeah, yeah, I couldn't look back after that.
mm. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
I also felt a little tingly
Yeah.
listening to you describe that experience. It was really beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's one that I think about so often. Like
Yes.
I'll never ever forget that moment.
Mm.
Yeah, really beautiful.
I'm really grateful to you for sharing it.
Of course.
Mm. As we close, Sheldamar, it's been wonderful to speak with you, and I'm so grateful for you being so generous in all of your sharing. I'm just curious because as we're drawing these threads, and so much of the experience of your psychedelic roots seems to connect back to your childhood, and we talk about a calling
Mm.
um, in a creative sense or a spiritual sense, and not to put too much weight onto it, but I'm curious if you feel like psychedelics called you in some way
I love this
because they are
question.
such an important part of your life nowadays.
Totally. I love this question. Um, I mean, the short answer is yes. You know,
Hmm.
all the way back to Christian Attitude Award and getting all those Bibles and being a good Sunday school kid. It felt like it came to me when it needed to come to me.
Hmm.
Although a little confusing at first,
Hmm.
but I think now more than ever, it's yeah. There's looking back, it was a spiritual sort of calling. I know I have creative capacities. My partner insists that I lean into calling myself an artist. I'm not there yet, but yeah, on the spiritual front, I I think from my use of psychedelics, and I think these days much more sparingly than I was experimenting in my early 20s. It's constantly been this sort of check in with myself as part of something larger than myself.
Mm.
And with all my work with food justice and now exploring the psychedelic space and really being interested in like what is psychedelic justice and thinking
Hmm.
about matters of equity and diversity and inclusion and justice and challenging these systems that we all live in, it feels like a calling to place myself in all of this messiness and chaos in the best way.
Hmm.
And it's funny, I've been thinking a lot about this analogy and I want to expand on it a little bit more, but it feels appropriate to share here.
Hmm.
A couple of months ago, I was hanging out with some friends. We're just hanging out on the bench, just chatting.
Hmm.
And I was sharing with them a little bit about my, what is it called? It was comparative mysticism with Dr.
Hmm.
Vallely at the University of Ottawa. Wonderful class. Just
Hmm.
talking about like some of my learnings I've been doing. And we kind of had this conversation about how humans can be hardwired for a spiritual experience and whether or not you believe that. Some really do think that's real. And I had this thought of like, what if we were all lights? Light, we can say a light bulb or a lamp or a light tower, whatever the case is. And really, part of what being on earth and our purpose is to make sure that we're sharing our light and we're bright. And we all have different strengths and gifts to share with that light, but just making sure that our light is on.
Hmm.
And the world around us reminds us like that's probably not important, right? And whether we're looking at capitalism, realism, and thinking that capitalism is it, or materialism and consumerism, and all these things that sort of pull us away from that inner knowing and from nature more broadly. If we could remember that we're all lights, that we could share our lights, do we have a duty at some point to not necessarily make sure other people's lights are on, but that they have a cord that could be plugged in so that their light can be on? And I think that's something that I find really beautiful, and whether we're
Hmm.
thinking about the psychedelic space or just ordinary life or the people around us, and it speaks to this idea of like not wanting to change the world, but really just trying to be the best version of myself so that others feel safe and warmed by my lights and that it could perhaps remind them that they also have a light to share with the world. And to me, that's kind of enough. And
Hmm.
of course, I'm doing the academia and I'm doing the research and all these different things, but I think in my personal sort of goal, I just want to continue to be that light for others. Yeah, and maybe they'll be able to plug themselves in, sort of thing. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah,
That's so beautiful. That's a beautiful way to end off, Sheldamar.
yeah.
Thank
Thank you.
thank you for being a light. And
Appreciate that. Of
thank you for sharing your light with me and in this
course.
forum. It's really a gift, and I'm so grateful.
I appreciate that, Amy. Yeah, thank you for giving me the space, and I will throw it back to you. I think this is a wonderful place to, invite people to share their experiences in a very safe and honest way. I feel like I could have shared so much more, but I think that's the nature of psychedelics. It's so interdisciplinary, and you could talk about different things.
Mm,
Uh, but I feel like I was able to give you the best parts of it all. So thanks for allowing me to.
thank you.